Hello, Ray. It's so great to have you here today in our newsroom. So, Ray, you are the host of TechBuzz China, a podcast that I listen to frequently. But for those of our audience who are not familiar with your work, can you introduce yourself a little bit and also introduce your podcast, TechBuzz China, a little bit to our audience?
Yeah, I'm using my podcast mic right now, so hopefully this is really good sound. So my name is Rui Ma. I'm a bilingual, bicultural analyst covering China tech. TechBuzz China is actually a passion project that I started about 3 years ago because I had worked in China from 2007 to 2015. And when I came back, I thought there was a little bit of a gap in coverage of Chinese tech companies, especially more on the analysis side. So there's a lot of news outlets already. And so I started as a passion project for fun and eventually turned it into a full-time thing at the beginning of last year when I realized there was actually a lot of institutional investors who really liked my program and liked the cultural and social context I give business problems. So our little podcast has now turned into a community for professional investors, fund managers, as well as company operators, anyone who's interested in deep dives on China tech.
Awesome. So tell us a bit about your own story. What got you interested in China's tech industry?
Yeah, so I grew up in Silicon Valley. So I was born in China, but I immigrated with my parents here to the US in 1989 when I was 8. And we settled in Silicon Valley. My parents are both engineers. I didn't even think about it and ended up choosing electrical engineering, computer science to study when I was going to college at Berkeley. And I just stayed in Silicon Valley, just feel very comfortable in the whole, tech environment. And after graduation, I worked in tech investment banking here in Menlo Park. When the opportunity came to move to China in 2007, for personal reasons, I had to go to China. So I moved there. And initially, I actually worked briefly in real estate investment there. It was really not my cup of tea. It was actually a great experience because it made me realize how much I actually just love tech. So I quickly switched back to tech as soon as I could, which was in 2009. I've been just doing it ever since. I think that this is a personal passion for me. And I also think that I happen to be just very lucky, right? In the past 20 years, because of the rise of the internet, there's just been so many opportunities. So many great companies, so many news stories, and especially for China tech, I was very, very, again, completely unplanned, very lucky to be there at the beginning of the tech boom of the last decade. So I would say, of course, there was already some great companies being founded in the late 90s and early 2000s, but the current crop of really strong tech companies, I would say most of their development and most of them were founded in the last 10 years. And I happened to be there when this was all happening and meeting everyone, seeing some of these companies. I met people from ByteDance back in 2013 when, barely anyone knew who they were. I didn't even realize I knew them until much later. They pop in the news and I'm like, wait, I know these people, right? So yeah, just been very lucky to be part of that story. And I think the awesome thing now, awesome and also terrible in some senses, is that tech has become just such a major player of, for example, the stock market, but now also in geopolitics, and everyone's looking at it. It's just such a big part of our lives. In fact, I almost want to say that there are no non-tech companies anymore because everyone has to use technology. So it's just how, is it your company's core competency?
I see. Speaking of China tech, we have to talk a little bit about Jack Ma. Jack Ma saga has captured a lot of international attention. Even just this morning, we saw the most recent turn in the story. Ant Group's CEO Simon Hu resigned. So that sort of just heightened the scrutiny over this Chinese fintech behemoth. So Ray, can you tell us a little bit about the story? What's the backstory here? Why was Ant Group's IPO pulled at the last minute by the Beijing authorities, and just giving us an idea of Ant Group's sort of future prospect to relaunch its IPO. It's going to be in 2 years, in 5 years. What's the timeline here?
Sure. So Again, there's been a lot of reporting on Ant, but I think even some of the most sort of critical Western media has come around to the fact that basically this was, I would characterize it as sort of a regulatory oversight, right? So, and having worked in China and actually interacted with the local, especially municipal governments, I can kind of understand how this happened. So, Ant is basically a very, very powerful platform born out of Alibaba back in 2004. They started Alipay, the wallet that is now used by 1 billion people worldwide, mostly in China, of course. So basically everyone that goes online on the Chinese internet has a WeChat account, but then also has an Alipay account. And it's just very powerful what they've done with that user base, right? So when payments was clearly not going to be the big moneymaker, they switched to having asset management products, so wealth management products like the money market funds, Yulabao, right? And that then also became regulated. So then they went into credit tech, which is online lending and consumer credit. That was basically not regulated very much in the past couple of years. But it was really a runaway success, right? So I don't know how familiar your audience is with the level of credit in China, but in general, individual and small business credit is not very well penetrated in China. The large banks don't do a very good job of serving small customers, in part because they don't actually have good credit data, right? The credit cards are very new in China, only in the last 20 years or so. Only something like 20% of the population have a credit card, et cetera. But Ant had this massive e-commerce platform on which people were transacting. And so they had a lot of data, and they were able to use that and apply algorithms to it and assess the credit worthiness of individuals as well as small businesses. And they made this into a very big business. It actually really only started back in 2015. But by the time they're ready to IPO, we're talking about 500 million people in China were using one of their credit products. And the average balance for their personal consumer credit product, which is like a credit card, which is actually, they call it they call it the Chinese version of Affirm. So I don't know if people in this audience are familiar with Affirm, buy now, pay later company that just went public. And the average balance was 300 USD. Now, it may not sound like a lot, but that's actually a good amount for especially people living in rural China, where 600 million people still live on incomes of less than $150 a month, right? So you're talking about, yeah, there might be some of those people owing $300. That's actually a lot. So when we think about why the Ant IPO was pulled, there is this aspect where Ant was really solving a true problem in the Chinese economy of serving, like I said, into small businesses and individuals. However, they were quite aggressive with how they were growing the business, in part because there was no regulatory oversight, really, right? They were doing this good thing for the economy, and lots of municipal governments, or I shouldn't say lots of, one in particular, the Chongqing government gave them licenses that they kind of took advantage of to do this online lending. By the time the IPO came about, it was regulations were already in play to regulate this industry. However, the timing wasn't super clear, and it was thought by most everyone that Ant would be able to pull off the IPO before the regulations came down. And the regulations were being negotiated, over a period of something like 2 years. But what happened was Jack Ma made this very incendiary speech at a very, very high level event. And he basically insulted the banking regulators, who are the regulators that eventually were appointed to take ownership of regulating Ant. And also, by the way, the banks are the people Ant's business kind of could potentially threaten. So this is just like a big no. And even though the IPO had priced, it ended up being pulled. And a flurry of regulations, like I said, that were already in play, not already in play, already in planning, were then put out. And these regulations, which are mostly around capital requirements and, how Ant has to be structured and more regulated like a bank, et cetera, is probably going to really hurt Ant's profit profile, and its ability to grow as quickly as it did in the past when it was doing something like every $100 of loans, it was actually only putting up $2 of capital. So that's not going to be the case going forward, in which case it's going to be, I think, a very long restructuring. So back to your question about what is the prospect for Ant going forward, I think it's pretty clear that Ant has already come to a high-level agreement with the government. So it's clear what Ant needs to do to comply with new regulations. However, because the new regulations change the business model quite a bit, I think that it would be unlikely for Ant to go public in the near term, because generally you want to show, right? You want to show like at least a year or two, if not 3 years of operating on a stable business model, right, before going out. So my answer would be not in the immediate future. So definitely not this year, probably not next year, maybe the year after. Who knows?
I see. So how much of it is unique to Ant? Do you see the possibility of another tech giant, say Tencent, got into problem with the regulators in the near future?
Well, Bloomberg already reported that Tencent is being asked to do the same, so do much of the same restructuring. I think Tencent's difference is that my understanding, again, because its payments is a subsidiary, and some of the activities are actually it's all basically private information. It's not like laid out in a prospectus as Ant. But my understanding is that they have held on to or they inject much more capital per dollar loaned out. So it wasn't as aggressive as Ant on the credit side. Therefore, while the regulations will still affect them, it may not affect them as much as it did Ant, just because Tencent was like always a little bit more conservative with how they were growing. But no, this is not directed specifically at Ant. I would say, though, that you can interpret it as being specifically directed at these large players, right? And the reason I say that is that it's not because the government hates business and just like wants to, can't stand any like private company getting big. It's not that. It's more like these companies have so many users and so much power that if they are not regulated, which they, like I said, they were not, it was not clear who was the regulatory authority overseeing them in the past. If they're not regulated, they can really get people into big trouble. And at the end of the day, if something goes wrong, people are going to get mad at Jack Ma and Pony Ma, but they're also going to blame the government, right? And it's also going to hurt the economy. So there is that sense involved where you really have to rein in the big players. Of course, there are many small players, but you don't really have to care about them if they're only serving like 10 million people, right? So
Gotcha. So, nowadays when we think about Chinese tech giants, the pressure comes not only from Beijing authorities, as in the case of Jack Ma, but also from overseas, like the US government. As you know, there has been growing concerns on the national security risks posed by Chinese tech giants, most notably Huawei and TikTok. So it's a little frustrating because when you hear debates on those issues, it's frequently not contextualized properly. So, tell us a bit about the national security risks here. What are the actual risks, and what in your mind is exaggerated or politicized?
Yeah, so I'm actually not a national security expert, but I was very lucky to be on a legal panel recently put on actually by the law firm who represented both WeChat and TikTok users in their lawsuit against the US government to basically fight against the executive orders banning them, right? So, and I learned a lot from that experience. My understanding is basically that the US has given the president specifically a lot of power in the past through several, I would just call them acts. So several acts in the past, some of them are long in the past, basically, that give the president powers to investigate or to put limits on any company for national security reasons. And these powers are actually quite broad, and they have I'm not sure if I can say that they have grown, but they have definitely not diminished over time, right? There's been nothing done to rein them in. Therefore, I would expect more investigations like this going forward, right? We've already seen that President Biden has already announced that he wants a thorough investigation of the supply chain for ICT. So, communication technologies in the US in the next year. There's various ongoing, I think, shorter term 100-day investigations into like battery technologies and other things like that. So I would expect those things to be ongoing. So national security as a concern. However, for specifically TikTok and WeChat, these are communication mediums, and there are specifically media, and they get a little bit more protection under US law. Is my understanding. So therefore, cases against these two companies were actually much harder to prove, at least as rules currently stand. I don't know if they'll change, right? Like, I don't know if we're going to give the president even more powers. So, and I would say, when I talk to cybersecurity experts, we generally agree that something that is, especially like TikTok, that is a public medium of communication. There are various ways to audit the technology, audit the algorithms, audit the content that is put out, and audit the flow of traffic, right? Because they actually use US-based servers. So there are many ways to make sure that these national security threats are either minimized or completely eliminated with companies like that. I think that it's actually a fairly easy solution. So I would say that was probably politicized. As for other things, like a Huawei, I don't actually know, right? Telecommunications hardware, I have no idea. I just, as someone who focuses on internet specifically, I would say, yeah, public communications, number one, is much more protected under law here. And there are just so many more ways that we could audit the results and make sure that it's kosher.
I see. So the Huawei case seems more involved and complicated. But let's just
I just don't have the expertise.
Gotcha. Yeah, so let's just leave aside the geopolitical debates a little bit and tell us a little bit about how those companies actually become so successful domestically and also abroad. What's their secret ingredient?
I think that actually, well, first of all, there's only a few, right? And I would say on the internet side, really, it is just ByteDance right now with TikTok. So luckily, I happen to be researching a lot on ByteDance, actually doing some academic research and writing a lot about it. So the short answer would be that ByteDance has really taken, I think, management very seriously and studied the successes of Silicon Valley. So Zhang Yiming, the CEO and founder, is very well known for being like a nerd about what we call 成功学, right? Like, so success stories. So he spent basically all his undergrad years reading famous people's biographies and trying to figure out how to succeed. He's also been very proactive about studying and reaching out to Silicon Valley CEOs here about how to manage. And what I see inside the company is that there is sort of the melding of like East and West wisdom. I actually hate to use those words, but it's kind of true, right? So like, it's very decentralized. He's taken the best of Silicon Valley, which is like very decentralized, empowering the employees, no hierarchy, and really high focus on innovation. But then he's also taken sort of like, I would call the Chinese approach of thinking of ecosystem thinking, of not really being just product focused, but also thinking about long-term strategies, about building out each part of a user's journey versus being really good at like a specific function. So in the West, we like to say like, oh, products are like Swiss Army knives, right? Where they're just like really, they may have multiple functions, or maybe they don't, but like they're really good at one thing, and then you like put it back. But a lot of Chinese products are actually very, very more platform driven, and they have like a longer flow where they accompany the journey user through a longer journey of actions. And I think that's something that ByteDance has been able to successfully combine with this sort of Western, decentralization and innovation, and combine that with the fact that, like, let's not forget the fact that in the past 10 years, China has become the largest digital economy in the world. It has the largest number of smartphone users, sort of highest penetration of mobile internet, right? Something like 99% of Chinese internet users access the web through mobile. And just having that scale allowed the company to really iterate on products quickly and also learn. So I think that let's not forget that, right? So he has the market advantage of China. He does also have the cheap labor there as well. So even today, developers in China cost like something like a quarter, maybe a third, sometimes of US employees. So he has that advantage. And then he has the sort of cultural and managerial insight, setting up the right systems. And yeah, he bet on the right product, which is an AI algorithm. And I think that's really what's interesting about ByteDance. I don't see too many other companies succeeding at that scale right now, but my sense or prediction would be that will be much more common going forward. That's because I talk to lots of entrepreneurs and early stage investors, and I see, number one, the confidence that ByteDance has given them. And by the way, ByteDance was emboldened by Huawei's success. So there are generations, right? We're talking about generations of iteration here. And the newest entrepreneurs are very much like Zhang Yiming, right? They understand Silicon Valley. Most of them have worked here. Very familiar with the culture. They are adapting the culture and then adapting and connecting it with the product or market insights that China has given them. And sometimes they're also partnering it with Chinese flexible supply chains, right? Again, also Chinese cheap labor costs. And I think we're going to see a lot more global companies in the future.
Gotcha. Since you already mentioned, I wanted to talk about payment a little bit. So I've heard lots of chatters about PBOC's proposed digital yuan, digital currency plan. So tell us a little more about that. When we hear it in the debate, it seems to be focusing on, its potential to undermine US dollar supremacy, its potential for, the Beijing authorities to bypass sanctions. It also affects mobile payment industry a little bit. So just give us a story here. What's actually going on?
Yeah, I mean, okay, so I have to caveat this with saying I'm not a digital currency expert. I looked into it for a few weeks, deeply for the sake of I did a podcast episode on it with another expert interviewing them. And I fielded various questions about it. But my current understanding is that, so first of all, it's a digital currency that it is basically backed by the central bank. So it's like a sovereign, and it's not a cryptocurrency, from a private entity. And it's just like meant to be a digital version of the RMB, just like cash. It's like literally digital cash. The primary reasons that have been given to me, and which make more sense to me, is that it's primarily to number one, upgrade the whole financial system, right? To make it more transparent to the regulators in charge, because now you can see much more transactions in the system, and you can then make smarter policies. And it is, as many people, or at least many experts say, it is to sort of take back some of the powers that have been ceded to these two giant platforms of Alipay and WeChat Pay that are effectively a duopoly in China, right? So they're like I said in the first question, there are various reasons why they were allowed to grow, because they do serve a purpose. They were spurring on economic development, but at this point, they're really large, and some of their practices are not necessarily helpful to at least the government and if not society. So, for example, Ant doesn't share all of its data with the government. And I would guess neither does WeChat Pay, although we don't know that for sure. So there's all this data that's being collected that could be really useful for policymaking, for, looking at the economy, et cetera, at least from the government's perspective, right? That is not being captured, right? So the government wants to put out an alternative. That makes a lot of sense to me. As for whether or not it will displace the USD, I haven't met a single person that thinks that could happen in the near term. And by near term, I mean next I don't know, 5-10 years minimum. I think most people are thinking it's a remote possibility if many other things go right? Because it's not just a matter of like, oh, I can now settle in RMB. Oh, I'm going to go, I don't know, like hold all RMB, or like have all my transactions be on RMB. That I don't think just that ease of transaction is going to, change the world order, so to speak. However, like it's not impossible, so I don't want to completely dismiss those fears. But I think in general, the right way to think about it is that it is the Chinese government upgrading the financial system. It is them wrestling back some control from the digital payment platforms. And by the way, they are not the only person doing this. Every single government, with the exception of the US, I think, or I shouldn't say every single, but there are many governments basically working on this, because it's 2021. Does it make sense to be still printing paper money? Like, so, and also we have like advanced blockchain technologies. Like we know that it's good for financial systems. So why wouldn't we be using them? Yeah. So lots of governments are going after this. They're just all doing it slightly different way. And China is probably like one of the first, it's actually not the first, it's one of the first to at least experiment at scale. And that's why you hear about it all the time.
Gotcha. Yeah, timing seems to be right. Next, I wanted to turn to sort of the innovation landscape more generally. So, if I look at the success stories of Chinese entrepreneurs like Pinduoduo, Meituan, Kuaishou, right? They seem to be very concentrated in consumer tech, social media app, and e-commerce, right? This sphere. So I don't want to call them low tech, but it certainly seems pretty low fat or like not hardcore tech to me. Have Chinese entrepreneurs actually eaten all the low-hanging fruits here? Do you expect this sphere to be crowded anytime soon? And what will be the next breakthrough? And what will be that like?
Yeah, so I actually just did a couple of events on this, and no, right now, actually everyone I talk to is very excited. Well, they're excited about everything in tech in China right now. But I would say a good portion of people are still very excited about what you call low-hanging fruit, right? And these things with not very much technology actually embedded in them. And that's just because like we still have rural China that is massive and that is still growing faster. That's still growing faster than urban China. A friend of mine thinks it's close to 10%. The official government stats tells you that it's over 7%. So rural China is massive and still growing relatively quickly. So you can see this from the latest initiatives by the internet companies, right? They're throwing a lot of money into rural e-commerce in the form of community group buying, which is basically grocery buying in groups, right? But it's really growing at the third tier and below cities. And that's because like, if you look at the e-commerce, let's call it technology penetration, but e-commerce is one of the first sectors always to get penetrated, right? If you look at e-commerce, it's just much less penetration in rural China, and especially for groceries, something like groceries, right? That I think the stat is something like 8% versus overall e-commerce for other category or for all categories is 36%. So therefore, you have this huge, massive multi-trillion dollar, or at least $1 trillion opportunity in the immediate near term. And that's just one thing. For other things, we have there's a whole new category of new products that are being built because of these e-commerce innovations. So a lot of new brands, right? My friends at China Tech Blog wrote a really, really good analysis on this, citing some stats from McKinsey, but to give you some perspective, in the US, MNCs, right? So not MNCs, foreign brands in sort of common consumer categories own about 26% of the market. In China, it's actually far higher at 40%. So what does that mean? That means typically that if you are going to grow into a developed economy like the US, then you would expect that local brands take the lion's share and it's not just foreign brands dominating. So you actually see a lot of internet entrepreneurs these days going into making consumer brands. So that's also another huge new category that's opening up that I think if you ask them, they would say it has tech because they're using digital marketing. They're using probably some kind of advanced manufacturing. But like at least the way we experience it, it's not like rockets or semiconductors. Therefore, it's not like deep tech. But that's also a huge area of growth. And but it is also true that in China there is now deep tech investment. I would say part of it, or at least some part of it, is accelerated by the sanctions, right? So the fact that there is all this geopolitical tension makes a deep tech supply chain that is dependent on foreign technologies. By the way, it's not just US, it's also Japanese, German technologies, etc. It makes people insecure. So they want to have a domestic supply chain. They call it actually choke point technologies, right? 卡脖子技术, right? And there's like a list. It's very public. It's like a list of 30 to 80, depending on which list you look at. And these technologies are also getting a lot of investment. So I would say it's the low-hanging fruit is not over by far, but there's also increasing investment into more hardcore tech.
Gotcha. Final question of the day. So looking ahead for the next few years or decade, what are some of the trends in the Chinese tech scenes you think are worth noting that have not been captured by the foreign media?
I think I would say, well, like just the consumer thing I talked about earlier, I haven't seen it covered much. It's actually discussed like endlessly in Chinese media, but basically you have this situation of, Chinese entrepreneurs taking advantage of local supply chains, digital marketing savviness that they've built up working in China and trying to export that abroad in the form of like new brands that are going to be global from day one. So I think that will be a trend to watch. We actually have one of those companies that's probably going to IPO soon called Shein. Most people don't realize it's a Chinese company, but it is. It's one of the best-selling like shopping apps here. It's very, very popular with Gen Z. I think that for other trends, another trend that I'm personally really interested in is I would call it let's call it infrastructure software, right? So in China, because of the massive scale of this like single market, so even though it's a single market, it's just so big. So what happens is that the high level of digitization has made these platforms had to build their own infrastructure to accommodate the amount of transactions, the amount of users they have, right? So a great example was Alibaba. Because they have this crazy Singles Day event, their database can actually handle almost 10 times the transactions per second as a Visa or MasterCard, right? And these infrastructure technologies, because they're battle tested in real life, right? These are not like theoretical things. They've been battle tested, they've been built. They're now being exported outside of these companies. So they're being spun off as that particular company called, I think it's called Ocean Base, has been officially spun off last year. And I think that we'll see more and more of these, right? It's not a rare concept. It's happened a lot here in the US where you basically have a lot of services or even parts of services like Amazon Web Services, et cetera, basically started off serving a very high profile internal customer and then getting good enough that it could then be exported as an external service, right? So you see that model. What I'm saying is that we haven't really seen that happen in China yet at large scale, but I think we're going to see more and more of that. There's already a few smaller companies that are doing this and getting global customers, but I think this might be a much bigger trend than many of us expect.
Gotcha. This has been such a helpful conversation. Thank you so much, Ray. It's been great talking to you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me. Hopefully that was helpful.
That was super helpful. Bye. Have a good rest of the day.
Okay. All right. Bye.